He laughed and said $1,800 was too generous for someone like me. 3 days later, his $95 million startup burned to the ground. And the one who lit the match was me. They called me lazy hands in that boardroom, said I didn't have the spark to lead. Now I'm watching from my coffee shop as their empire crumbles, their investors flee, and their golden boy gets escorted out by security. This is the story of how I used 3 lines of code and 1 unsigned contract to destroy everything they built. My name is Madison Brooks, but everyone at Hawthorne Labs called me Maddie. I'd been their senior systems engineer for 6 years, the kind of employee who arrived at 7:30 a.m. and left when the servers were stable, not when the clock said 5. I was 34, divorced, no kids, and I'd poured everything into this company because I believed in what we were building. The performance review meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday that smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. The conference room had those floor-to-ceiling windows that made Austin's skyline look like a postcard. But all I could focus on was the spreadsheet projected on the wall showing our annual bonuses. Ethan Caldwell stood at the head of the table, his designer sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as he paced. 28 years old, Stanford MBA, son of our CEO, and recently appointed as our Chief Innovation Officer, a title his father created just for him. His hair was perfectly styled, his teeth professionally whitened, and his understanding of our actual technology was professionally non-existent. "Let's talk about performance bonuses," he said, clicking through slides with the confidence of someone who'd never written a line of code in his life. "We need to reward excellence and innovation, the people who truly drive this company forward." I sat 3 seats from the end, between Alex Harper, our infrastructure architect, and Sophia Vega, the new project manager Ethan had hired from some startup that made an app for rating coffee shops. My hands were folded on the table, steady, even though I'd been up until 3 a.m. fixing a critical security breach that could have cost us millions. "Madison Brooks," Ethan said, and my name in his mouth sounded like an accusation. He highlighted my row on the spreadsheet. $1,800. The room went quiet. I'd been expecting at least 10,000. Last year, I'd gotten 12. This year, I'd single-handedly architected the security framework for Firecrest, our flagship AI platform that had attracted $95 million in Series B funding. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steady even though my stomach was churning. Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that belonged on a shark. $1,800. To be honest, that's quite generous for someone who just maintains things. We need builders, Madison, innovators, not lazy hands doing routine work. Someone laughed. I think it was Brad from marketing. Then Sophie giggled, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. Soon, half the room was chuckling, the sound bouncing off those beautiful windows and hitting me like shrapnel. "Lazy hands," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Look," Ethan said, his tone shifting to fake sympathy. "I know you've been here a while, but tenure doesn't equal value. You don't have the spark we need for the next phase. You're good at following instructions, maintaining legacy systems, but Hawthorne Labs is about disruption, revolution, and frankly, you're more evolution, slow evolution." He clicked to the next slide. Sophia was getting 25,000, Brad, 30,000. The new blockchain integration specialist Ethan had hired, who I'd caught Googling "what is blockchain" last week, was getting 40,000. "The future belongs to those who can see it," Ethan continued, looking directly at me. "Not those who just keep the lights on." I looked down at my hands. These hands had built the authentication system that protected our entire user database. These hands had written the encryption protocols that kept our intellectual property safe. These hands had created the very foundation that Firecrest stood on. But in that moment, looking at my reflection in the polished table, I made a decision. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't defend myself. I wouldn't even quit in anger. I would do something much, much worse. "Thank you for the feedback," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I appreciate the transparency." Ethan looked surprised, maybe even disappointed that I hadn't fought back. "Good," That's good, professional. The meeting continued for another hour, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about the code I'd written, the security protocols I'd implemented, and most importantly, the ownership clause I'd never signed over to the company. They thought I was just maintaining things. They had no idea I was the keeper of the keys to their kingdom. And in 3 days, they'd learn exactly what lazy hands could do when they stopped holding everything together. That night, I stayed late at the office, but not for the reasons everyone assumed. While the cleaning crew vacuumed around me and the city lights twinkled beyond the windows, I dove deep into the architecture of Firecrest, our $95 million baby. Firecrest was supposed to revolutionize enterprise AI integration. The pitch deck Ethan loved showing investors promised seamless connectivity between legacy systems and cutting-edge machine learning models. What the pitch deck didn't mention was that the entire security framework, the bridge that made this magic possible, was built on code I'd written independently, on my own time, before Firecrest was even conceived. I pulled up the Git history at 11:45 p.m. There it was, commit after commit, all tagged with my personal email, not my company address, the authentication protocols, the encryption layers, the firewall logic I developed them as part of my open source contributions, then adapted them for Hawthorne Labs. The company had been so eager to use my solution that they'd never bothered with the paperwork. No assignment of intellectual property, no work-for-hire agreement, nothing. Ethan had been too busy replacing our senior engineers with his LinkedIn connections to notice. Over the past 6 months, he'd pushed out everyone who understood the bones of our system. Marcus, who'd built our database architecture, was replaced by a data evangelist who gave great TED Talks but couldn't write a SQL query. Jennifer, our QA lead, was swapped for a growth hacker who believed testing was too slow for disruption. Now the team was full of people who knew how to make beautiful PowerPoints, but couldn't debug their way out of a syntax error. They called themselves thought leaders and innovation catalysts. Ethan called them the future. I called them passengers on a ship they didn't know how to sail. My phone buzzed. A text from Alex Harper. One of the few competent people left. You okay? That meeting was brutal. Never better, I replied. Ethan's an ass. Everyone knows you built half this company. Not half, I typed back. Just the important parts. I opened a new terminal window and began documenting everything. Every function, every dependency, every integration point that relied on my code. It was like creating an X-ray of Firecrest's skeleton, showing exactly which bones I owned. The real beauty was in the complexity. Ethan and his new team had built so much on top of my foundation that removing it would be like pulling a card from the bottom of a house of cards. They'd created features, added integrations, made promises to investors, all assuming my code would always be there, humming quietly in the background, doing the routine work of keeping everything secure and connected. At 2:30 a.m., I found the smoking gun in our legal documentation. Diana Ruiz, our chief legal officer, had sent multiple emails requesting IP assignment agreements for all core code. The emails had been ignored, buried under Ethan's revolutionary new initiatives. Diana was meticulous, though she'd covered herself by documenting every attempt, creating a paper trail that showed the company's negligence. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the Firecrest dashboard glowing on my screen. The system was beautiful, elegant even. It processed millions of requests daily, connected dozens of enterprise clients, and validated Hawthorne Labs' unicorn valuation. And at its heart, wrapped around every critical function like DNA, was my code. Ethan thought I was a maintainer, a keeper of legacy systems, someone without spark. He had no idea I was Atlas, holding up his entire world. The difference was, Atlas was cursed to carry his burden forever. I started typing an email to Diana, carefully worded, professionally concerned. During my review of system documentation, I noticed some potential IP compliance issues with core security modules. I want to ensure proper attribution and ownership are clearly established before the production release next week. Please advise on the proper protocol. Then I created a new branch in our codebase, labeling it IP-Sensitive Assets Review. I didn't delete anything, didn't sabotage anything. I simply wrapped my code in compliance flags, added ownership notices, and created dependencies that would require explicit authorization from the IP owner me before deployment. It was 3:45 a.m. when I finally shut down my laptop. The office was empty except for security guards and the ghosts of better decisions. Tomorrow, I would submit my resignation, effective immediately. No 2 weeks' notice, no knowledge transfer, no documentation beyond what I just created. Ethan wanted to build the future without me. Fine. Let him try building it without the foundation I'd laid. As I walked to the elevator, I passed the wall of press clippings celebrating Hawthorne Labs' success. There was Ethan, smiling beside his father, under a headline reading "The Next Generation of Tech Leadership." In 3 days, there would be new headlines, and they wouldn't be smiling. The next morning, I arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, my resignation letter printed on the good paper, the kind that felt expensive between your fingers. I'd kept it simple. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position at Hawthorne Labs. Thank you for the opportunities provided. But before I delivered it, I had work to do. I logged into our compliance system and began the most thorough documentation of my career. Every piece of code I'd written was now tagged with metadata creation date, ownership status, IP classification. The security modules at Firecrest's core were marked as IP-sensitive asset, pending ownership verification. Then I added a single line to the production deployment checklist, buried on page 47 of a document no one ever read. Verify IP ownership of all sensitive assets with primary logic owner before release. It wasn't sabotage, it was due diligence. At 9:15 a.m., I submitted a formal compliance report to Diana Ruiz's team. The subject line was innocuous: routine IP audit, security modules. The content was a time bomb wrapped in legalese. I detailed every function, every algorithm, every line of code that belonged to me, not Hawthorne Labs. I included timestamps, commit histories, and most importantly, the absence of any signed IP transfer agreements. Diana's assistant responded within minutes. Received, Ms. Ruiz will review. Perfect. The paper trail was established. At 10 a.m., I walked into Ethan's corner office. He was on a video call, gesturing dramatically at his webcam while using words like synergy and paradigm shift. I waited until he finished, then placed my resignation on his desk. He read it and laughed, actually laughed. Seriously, you're rage quitting because of the bonus. I'm pursuing other opportunities, I said calmly. What opportunities you think anyone else wants, someone who just maintains legacy code? He leaned back in his ergonomic chair, fingers laced behind his head. Madison, I did you a favor yesterday. That feedback, that was a gift. Now you can grow, evolve, become someone who matters in tech. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd had in that office in months. You're right, I should evolve. Exactly, see no hard feelings. Take your 2 weeks, help with the transition. It's effective immediately. His smugness cracked slightly. That's not professional. We have the Firecrest production launch next week. Sophia can handle it. She has the spark, remember? The security protocols are all documented in the compliance system. Everything's tagged and classified. Now he looked annoyed. Fine, whatever. We'll manage. We always do. He signed my resignation without reading the attached terms, which included a clear statement that no IP transfer had occurred for work created outside company time. Ethan was too busy, too important, too convinced of his own brilliance to read the fine print. I packed my desk slowly, methodically. 6 years fit into one cardboard box. Alex stopped by, confused and concerned. You're really leaving today? It's time, I said, placing my coffee mug, the one that said World's Okayest Programmer, into the box. But Firecrest will launch exactly as planned. Alex studied my face. He knew me well enough to recognize when I was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. What did you do? Nothing. I just made sure everything was properly documented. Madison. Check the compliance system. Page 47 of the deployment checklist. You might find it interesting. I created one final piece of insurance before I left. In our shared documentation system, I created a folder titled Legacy Maintenance Protocols, Madison Brooks. Inside, I placed a single-file IP ownership notice. The document was a masterpiece of corporate cover-your-ass literature. It explained, in excruciating detail, that the core security modules of Firecrest were built on proprietary code I owned personally. It referenced Diana's emails requesting IP agreements. It cited the company's failure to secure proper ownership, and it included a helpful note that any production deployment without proper authorization could constitute IP theft. I set the document's permissions to read only, with automatic notifications to Diana's team, the board of directors, and our biggest investors if anyone tried to modify or delete it. At noon, I walked out of Hawthorne Labs for the last time. Security took my badge, my parking pass, my company laptop. They didn't take my knowledge, my code, or most importantly, my legal rights. Ethan sent a company-wide email that afternoon. Madison Brooks has decided to pursue other opportunities. We wish her the best in her future endeavors. Her responsibilities will be distributed among our innovative team. This is an exciting opportunity for Hawthorne Labs to streamline our operations and focus on what really matters: disruption and growth. Sophia replied, all with champagne emojis. Brad added fire emojis. The new blockchain specialist wrote, "Wog me," which I had to Google. Apparently it meant, "We're all gonna make it." They had no idea what was coming. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine. My phone silent for the first time in years. No urgent calls about server crashes. No midnight messages about security breaches. Just quiet. In 4 days, Firecrest would attempt to go live. The countdown had begun. The first day after I left, Ethan launched Project Nova, his grand initiative to prove Hawthorne Labs didn't need its legacy maintainers. He assembled his hand-picked team in the main conference room at 9 a.m. sharp, the walls covered with motivational posters he'd ordered from some startup guru's website. I knew all this because Alex was texting me play-by-play updates from the meeting. He just said, "We're not just launching a product, we're launching a revolution." Alex messaged, "Sophia is literally taking notes on her iPad with a stylus that costs more than my car payment." Sophia Vega had been given complete control of the Firecrest launch, 25 years old, with a background in growth hacking and user experience optimization. She'd never shipped production code in her life, but she had 500,000 followers on LinkedIn where she posted daily about crushing it in tech. "Team, we're going to show the old guard how it's done," Ethan announced, according to Alex. "No more lengthy security reviews, no more compliance bottlenecks. We move fast and break things." What things, someone had apparently asked. Barriers, limitations, the status quo. Sophia created a new timeline that promised deployment in 3 days instead of the original week. She called it aggressive but achievable. She'd reorganized the launch plan into something she called a sprint festival, complete with daily stand-ups at 7 a.m. and vibe checks at 6 p.m. The new blockchain specialist, his name was Trevor, was put in charge of system integrity. When someone asked if he'd reviewed the security protocols, he'd responded, "Security is a mindset, not a checklist." Alex sent me screenshots of the new deployment dashboard Sophia had created. It was beautiful, all pastel colors and smooth animations. It showed every task as on track or ahead of schedule. There was no yellow, there was no red. In Sophia's world, everything was always green. "She's marked the IP compliance check as completed," Alex messaged. "But Diana's out of office until Thursday." "Interesting," I replied. What Sophia didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the compliance system had automated locks. Without Diana's explicit approval, without the proper signatures, the system would block any production deployment. I hadn't built that feature. Diana had, after a previous incident where someone had pushed unlicensed code that nearly got us sued. Day 2. The problems started small. The development environment began throwing warning messages. IP-sensitive asset detected. Verification required. Trevor dismissed them. Probably just old error handling from the legacy code. I'll suppress those warnings. He wrote a script to hide the messages. Out of sight, out of mind. The dashboard stayed green. Sophia announced they were ahead of schedule. Ethan sent a company-wide email praising the new energy in the engineering department. He specifically mentioned how much smoother everything was running without the bureaucratic overhead of the past. The investors were invited to a launch party scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. Catering was ordered, press releases were drafted. Ethan had even hired a DJ because nothing says enterprise AI platform like house music and craft cocktails. Meanwhile, the warnings were multiplying in the background. Hidden by Trevor's script, but still there, accumulating in log files no one was reading. The system was trying to tell them something was wrong, but they'd covered its mouth with tape. Alex forwarded me an email thread where the DevOps team was raising concerns. There are dependencies we don't understand, one engineer wrote. The security modules are referencing ownership files we can't access. Sophia's response, let's not get caught up in the weeds. Focus on the vision. Ethan added, exactly, we're not here to understand every line of code. We're here to ship products and disrupt industries. On day 3, they attempted a test deployment to the staging environment. This is where my trap began to close. The staging server accepted the initial push, then immediately locked down. Every API call returned a 403 forbidden error. The database connections were refused. The authentication system went into what it called compliance protection mode. Trevor spent 6 hours trying to override it. He couldn't. The lock wasn't in the application layer, it was in the kernel itself, woven into the very fabric of how the system operated. It's like the code is fighting us, he complained in a Slack message that Alex screenshot for me. Sophia called an emergency meeting at 8 p.m. This is just a minor hiccup, she announced. We've identified the issue and we're resolving it. What's the issue? Someone asked. Technical debt from the old system. We're refactoring as we speak. She had no idea what refactoring meant, but it sounded proactive and solution-oriented. The dashboard remained green. In her status report to Ethan, she wrote, slight delay in staging deployment due to legacy system conflicts. Team is working through the night. Launch still on track. Ethan forwarded her report to the investors with his own addition. This is exactly why we needed fresh blood in engineering. They're identifying and solving problems the old team never even saw. That night, while Sophia's team was refactoring, the real problem was sitting in Diana Ruiz's inbox, marked as high priority, waiting for her return from her conference in Denver. 47 unread compliance alerts, each one documenting another attempt to deploy proprietary code without authorization. The countdown continued. 24 hours until the launch party, 24 hours until Ethan's revolution met reality. Launch day arrived with the kind of aggressive optimism that only comes from complete ignorance of impending disaster. The office was decorated with silver balloons spelling out, "Firecrest flies today." The DJ was setting up his equipment in the main lobby. Investors were already arriving for the 2 p.m. presentation. At 9 a.m., Sophia initiated the production deployment. The first error appeared within seconds. Authorization required clause 4.3b compliance lock engaged. The dashboard, for the first time in 3 days, showed red. What the hell is clause 4.3b? Ethan demanded, storming into the war room they'd set up for the launch. Trevor was frantically typing, sweat already forming on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. It's some kind of compliance lock. The system is requesting authorization from someone called the primary IP owner. Who's that? I don't know. The production servers began rejecting every deployment attempt. The error messages cascaded across their screens like a digital avalanche. API Gateway 503 service unavailable. IP authorization required. Database sync failed time zone mismatch. security protocol violation, sandbox environment, critical error, unauthorized access to proprietary modules. Sophia's beautiful dashboard turned into a Christmas tree of red alerts. The pastel colors and smooth animations couldn't hide the fact that nothing, absolutely nothing, was working. "It's probably just a configuration issue," Sophia said, her voice pitched higher than usual. "Trevor, can you override the compliance system?" "I'm trying. But it's like the entire security framework is locked from the inside. Every time I try to bypass it, it references some documentation I don't have access to." Ethan pulled up the deployment checklist on his laptop, scrolling frantically, page after page of procedures he'd never bothered to read. Then, on page 47, he found it, "Verify IP ownership of all sensitive assets with primary logic owner before release." "Who wrote this?" he shouted. Alex, who had been quietly watching from the corner, spoke up. "Madison. She wrote most of our compliance protocols." "Well, override them, delete them, do something." "We can't," Alex said quietly. "The compliance system has legal ramifications. If we force a deployment without proper authorization, we could be violating IP law." At 10:30 a.m., Diana Ruiz arrived at the office, fresh from her conference. Her assistant immediately pulled her aside, tablet in hand, showing her the 47 urgent compliance alerts. Diana's face went from confused to concerned to absolutely furious as she read through them. She marched straight into the war room. "Stop everything," she commanded. "Stop the deployment immediately." "Diana, we can fix this," Ethan pleaded. "The investors are already here." "The investors are the least of your problems." She pulled up the IP ownership notice I'd filed. "According to our records, the entire security framework of Firecrest is built on code that Madison Brooks created independently. She never signed over the rights. We don't own it." The room went silent except for the sound of Trevor's mechanical keyboard as he finally stopped typing. "That's impossible," Ethan said. "She was an employee. Everything she wrote belongs to the company." "Not if she wrote it on her own time, with her own resources, before the project existed," Diana explained. "Which, according to these commit histories, she did, and you signed her resignation papers that explicitly stated no IP transfer had occurred." Sophia's dashboard flickered, then died completely. The production servers had gone into full lockdown mode. "Get Madison back," Ethan ordered. "Offer her whatever she wants." "With what authority?" Diana asked. "You just spent the last week telling everyone she was replaceable. You called her lazy hands in a room full of witnesses. You think she's going to come running back?" Alex's phone buzzed. A text from me. "How's the launch party looking?" He typed back, "Like the Titanic, but with worse music." At noon, with the investors gathering in the presentation hall, Ethan tried calling me. I let it go to voicemail. "Madison, hey, it's Ethan. Look, there might have been some misunderstandings. We need to talk about the Firecrest deployment. Call me back, please." At 12:30, he called again. "Madison, we need you. The company needs you. I'm willing to discuss significant compensation, stock options, title change, whatever you want." At 1 p.m., with the presentation an hour away, CEO Richard Caldwell. Ethan's father called me personally. "Ms. Brooks, I apologize for my son's behavior. We need to resolve this situation. What are your terms?" I finally answered. "Mr. Caldwell, I left detailed documentation about the IP ownership issues before my departure. Your legal team has had 3 days to address them. I'm afraid any negotiations would need to start with acknowledgement of my intellectual property rights and compensation for the unauthorized attempt to use my code." "How much?" "I'm not interested in selling, but I might consider licensing, through my new consulting firm, shall we say, $95 million. That's what Firecrest is worth, isn't it?" The line went quiet. "That's extortion." "That's market value. Or you can rebuild Firecrest from scratch without my code. Your choice." I hung up. Back at the office, the war room looked like a hospital emergency department. Empty coffee cups, discarded energy drinks, and the faint smell of desperation. The deployment was completely frozen. The investor presentation was in 45 minutes, and they had nothing to show except error messages and a very expensive DJ. Diana Ruiz had spent the last hour combing through every piece of documentation in our legal archives. What she found was damning beyond anyone's imagination. She entered the war room at 1:15 p.m., carrying a single manila folder, the kind that destroys companies. "I need everyone to leave except Ethan and Mr. Caldwell," she announced. The room emptied quickly, Sophia practically running out, her designer heels clicking against the floor in rapid staccato. Trevor muttered something about updating his resume. Only Alex lingered by the door until Diana's glare sent him away too. She opened the folder and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. Clause 43B from our internal compliance manual, authored by Madison Brooks 18 months ago and approved by the board. Richard Caldwell picked up the paper, his face aging 10 years as he read. Any logic designated as IP-sensitive can only be deployed in production with explicit written authorization from the original author, regardless of employment status. "She wrote the rules," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "She wrote the rules, and we approved them." "It gets worse," Diana continued. "I found this in my archives from 6 months ago." She produced an email thread. "I repeatedly requested IP assignment agreements for all critical code. Madison flagged her security framework as personal IP that predated her employment. I sent 5 requests for proper documentation, all ignored." "By who?" Richard asked, though his eyes were already on his son. "By the newly appointed Chief Innovation Officer who declared legal reviews innovation blockers," Diana said flatly. She pulled out another document. "This is Madison's original employment contract, standard IP assignment for work created during company time. But here," she pointed to a subsection, "anything created before employment or on personal time remains the employee's property unless explicitly transferred. She never transferred the security framework." "Can we claim it was work for hire?" Ethan asked desperately. With the commit history showing weekend and late-night timestamps from her personal email, with her paying for her own GitHub repository, with documentation showing she offered it to the company as a pre-existing solution. Diana shook her head. "We'd lose that case in minutes." At 1:45 p.m., with 15 minutes until the presentation, Diana delivered the killing blow. "I've consulted with outside counsel. If we proceed with the deployment without Madison's authorization, she can sue us for IP theft. Given the documentation trail and the value of Firecrest, damages could exceed our valuation. The investors could then sue us for fraud. The company would be finished." Richard Caldwell stood up slowly, straightening his tie. Options. 3. Cancel the launch. Rebuild Firecrest from scratch without Madison's code. Timeline 12 to 18 months minimum. 2. Negotiate a licensing agreement with Madison on her terms. 3. Admit defeat. Return the investor money, and shut down the project. "There has to be another way," Ethan insisted. "We can't let one disgruntled employee—" "Stop," his father commanded. "She's not disgruntled. She's intelligent. She laid a perfect trap and you walked into it with your eyes wide open." Alex, listening from outside the door, texted me, "Diana just called your plan a perfect trap. I think she's impressed." At 2 p.m., the investors gathered in the presentation hall. The DJ had been quietly dismissed. The champagne remained corked. Richard Caldwell took the stage alone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I need to inform you that we're postponing the Firecrest launch due to unexpected compliance issues." The murmur from the crowd was immediate and harsh. "What kind of compliance issues?" demanded Marcus Webb, their lead investor. Richard looked at Diana, who stepped forward with her folder. "We've discovered that critical components of Firecrest were built on intellectual property that Hawthorne Labs doesn't own. We're working to resolve the situation." "How the hell did this happen?" another investor shouted. Diana placed the folder on the podium. "A combination of negligence in our IP documentation process and a failure to properly value our senior engineering talent. The engineer who owns the code left the company 3 days ago." Get them back. We've attempted to. The terms being requested are substantial. Marcus Webb stood up. I want to see all documentation, now, and I want to know who's responsible for this disaster. All eyes turned to Ethan, who seemed to shrink into his designer sneakers. The emergency board meeting was called for 3 p.m. I know because Alex was live texting me from his hiding spot near the boardroom. Webb just said gross negligence, he messaged. Now he's saying fiduciary responsibility. Ethan looks like he might cry. The board voted unanimously. Ethan was removed from his position effective immediately. The entire Project Nova team was under review. Sophia's LinkedIn profile would need updating. At 4 p.m., my phone rang. Diana Ruiz. Madison, I'm calling as Chief Legal Officer. We'd like to discuss a licensing agreement for your code. I'm listening. We're prepared to offer you a consulting contract, $1 million annually, plus royalties on any products built with your framework. No? Then what do you want? I smiled, looking out at the Austin skyline from my apartment. I want Ethan to call me personally and apologize. I wanted in writing that my code was essential to Firecrest, and I want $5 million upfront, plus 30% of any revenue generated using my security framework. That's less than what you'll lose if Firecrest fails. Webb is already talking about pulling out, isn't he? Diana was quiet for a long moment. I'll present your terms to the board. The call came at 6:17 p.m. Ethan's voice was small, defeated. Madison. It's Ethan. I need to apologize. I was wrong about you, about everything. You're not lazy hands. You're the foundation of this company. We need you. I'm sorry. Send it in writing, I said, and hung up. The emergency board meeting reconvened at 7 p.m. that evening. The boardroom had the atmosphere of a funeral, if funerals involved angry venture capitalists threatening lawsuits. Marcus Webb sat at the head of the table, having effectively taken control from Richard Caldwell, who looked like he'd aged a decade in the last 5 hours. Diana placed my terms on the table. Ms. Brooks has responded to our request for a licensing agreement. $5 million upfront and 30% of revenue, Webb read aloud. That's highway robbery. That's the cost of building your house on someone else's land without permission, Diana replied. We can accept her terms, or we can watch $95 million in investment evaporate. Another board member, Patricia Huang from Vertex Capital, pulled up her laptop. I've been reviewing the technical documentation. Can someone explain to me how one engineer owned this much critical infrastructure without anyone noticing? Diana pulled up the Git history on the main screen. Madison Brooks built the security framework over 2 years ago as a personal project. When Firecrest was conceived, we needed a solution quickly. She offered her existing code. In the rush to meet investor deadlines, proper IP transfer was never completed. And whose responsibility was that? Patricia asked, though everyone knew the answer. The Chief Innovation Officer was responsible for technical oversight, Diana said carefully. He repeatedly dismissed legal concerns as bureaucratic obstacles. Webb turned to Richard Caldwell. Your son cost us $95 million. The investment isn't lost, Richard said weakly. If we meet Madison's terms. If we meet her terms, we're giving away 30% of our revenue to someone who doesn't even work here anymore. Webb slammed his hand on the table. This is what happens when you promote based on nepotism instead of competence. At 8:30 p.m., the board reached a decision. They would make one final attempt to negotiate with me, but this time, they'd send Diana alone, the only person in the company who'd actually tried to prevent this disaster. Diana called me at 9 p.m. Madison, it's Diana. I'm alone. No one's listening. Can we speak honestly? We can. You planned this from the moment Ethan insulted you in that meeting, didn't you? I planned it from the moment he called me lazy hands. Diana actually laughed, a sharp, appreciative sound. The board is prepared to meet most of your terms. $5 million up front is approved, but they're struggling with 30%. Would you consider 20 mil? Diana, you've always been straight with me, so I'll be straight with you. I know Firecrest has contracts worth $300 million over the next 3 years. 20% of that is $60 million. 30% is $90 million. They tried to give me an $1,800 bonus for building the foundation of a $95 million platform. Now they can pay market rate. The board won't like it. The board should have thought of that before letting Ethan turn the engineering department into his personal kingdom of incompetence. Diana was quiet for a moment. You know what? You're right. I'll make them accept it. But I need something from you, a guarantee that you won't publicly discuss what happened here. The company's reputation is hanging by a thread. I'll sign an NDA as part of the agreement, but Ethan's apology letter, that goes in my personal files. At 10:15 p.m., Ethan's written apology arrived in my inbox. I had to give him credit. It was more thorough than I'd expected. Ms. Brooks, I am writing to formally apologize for my unprofessional behavior and gross underestimation of your contributions to Hawthorne Labs. My comments about lazy hands and lack of spark were not only incorrect, but demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes a technology company successful. You built the foundation that Firecrest stands on. Without your security framework, without your foresight and technical excellence, we have nothing. I let my ego and inexperience blind me to the reality that experience and deep technical knowledge matter more than buzzwords and presentation skills. I have resigned from my position at Hawthorne Labs, effective immediately. I hope my departure and this apology can begin to repair some of the damage I've caused. Respectfully, Ethan Caldwell. Alex texted me a photo from the office. Ethan was cleaning out his desk, the same cardboard box I'd used 3 days ago, now holding his collection of startup culture books and motivational posters. At 11 p.m., the final documentation was sent to my lawyer. $5 million would be wired to my account by Monday. 30% of all Firecrest revenue would follow quarterly. My security framework would remain in the product, but now it would make me wealthy instead of dismissed. The Financial Times would later run a small piece about the restructuring at Hawthorne Labs, noting only that there had been leadership changes and a delay in product launch. They never mentioned the engineer who'd brought a $95 million company to its knees with 3 days of patience and perfect documentation. Richard Caldwell called me one last time, at 11:45 p.m. Ms. Brooks, the agreements are signed. You've won. I hope you're satisfied. Mr. Caldwell, I was satisfied the moment your son laughed at $1,800. Everything else was just business. We could have been partners. You could have been our CTO. I could have been a lot of things if your company valued engineering over ego. Good luck with the new team. I hung up and poured myself a glass of wine. Outside my window, Austin's lights sparkled like code executing perfectly beautiful, logical, and under complete control. Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. I sat in my favorite coffee shop on South Congress, laptop open, watching my bank account refresh. The wire transfer hit at $9.035 million. Clean, legal, mine. The barista, recognizing me as a regular, brought over my usual accortado with an extra shot. You look happy today, she said. Just got a promotion, I replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. My phone buzzed with a text from Alex. Emergency board meeting at 10. Webb is cleaning house. Sophia just got escorted out by security. I took a sip of my coffee and pulled up LinkedIn on my laptop. Sophia Vega's profile had already been updated. Seeking new opportunities in growth hacking and innovation strategy. Her post about learning from failure had 12 likes. Ethan hadn't posted anything since Thursday. His last update about disrupting the disruption now read like prophecy. At 10:30, another text from Alex. They just announced the new CTO, Diana Ruiz. First thing she did was institute mandatory IP documentation for all code. You changed this place. I smiled. Diana would do well. She understood what Ethan never did, that the foundation matters more than the facade. By noon, news had leaked to TechCrunch. The headline was gentle. Hawthorne Labs announces leadership restructuring, delays flagship product launch. The article mentioned compliance issues and strategic realignment. My name appeared nowhere. The NDA was worth the silence. But the Austin tech community is small, and whispers travel fast. My phone started buzzing with messages from recruiters, former colleagues, other startup CTOs. Everyone wanted to know what really happened. Everyone wanted to know if I was available. I wasn't, not anymore. At 2 p.m., I formed my own LLC, Brooks Security Solutions. My first client would be Hawthorne Labs, licensing my framework for 30% of their revenue. But there would be others. Companies that actually valued the people who built their foundations. Marcus Webb called me at 3:15 p.m. Ms. Brooks, Marcus Webb from Vertex Capital. I heard through certain channels about your negotiation skills. We have a portfolio company that needs a security audit. Interested. My rate is $10,000 per day. Minimum 7-day engagement. He didn't even pause. Send me the contract. By Wednesday, the Hawthorne Labs that Ethan had tried to build was gone. The ping-pong table was removed. The motivational posters came down. The DJ's contact was deleted. Diana instituted what she called boring excellence, a culture focused on documentation, testing, and respecting the people who did the unglamorous work of keeping systems running. Firecrest finally launched 2 weeks later. After proper testing and documentation, it worked flawlessly. The investors were mollified, the company survived, and every quarter, 30% of their revenue would remind them of the cost of disrespecting the people who build the foundations. I ran into Ethan 3 months later at a Whole Foods in downtown Austin. He was wearing a hoodie instead of his usual designer clothes, pushing a cart like any other Sunday shopper. He saw me and froze. Madison. Ethan? I'm working at a small firm now. Building management software. Actually coding this time. Good for you. He shifted uncomfortably. I learned something from what happened, the hard way. But I learned. What's that? That the people maintaining the foundations, the ones doing the routine work, they're the ones with the real power. They just usually choose not to use it. I nodded. Lazy hands, right? He winced. I'll never live that down, will I? Every quarter when my royalty check arrives, I remember it. He actually laughed a real laugh, not the performative one from the boardroom. Fair enough. Take care, Madison. You too, Ethan. I watched him walk away. This former chief innovation officer now humbled into humanity. Maybe he'd become a decent engineer someday. Maybe he'd remember to respect the people who did the quiet work. As for me, I finished my shopping and drove home to my new apartment, the one with the view of Lady Bird Lake that $5 million in the bank could afford. My phone had 17 messages from potential clients, all wanting the security expertise of someone who'd become a legend in Austin tech circles. The woman who'd brought down a $95 million startup with documentation and patience. They called me different things now. Security genius, strategic mastermind, the engineer who played the long game. But my favorite came from Diana. In a text she sent after the first quarterly payment was processed, the woman with the smartest hands in tech. Not lazy, never lazy. Just patient enough to wait for the right moment to show everyone what those hands could really do. The coffee shop where I'd watched that wire transfer come through became my office. Every morning at 9 a.m., I'd sit in the same spot, building security frameworks for companies smart enough to value them. And sometimes, when young engineers would recognize me and ask for advice, I'd tell them the same thing. Document everything, own your work, and never, ever let anyone call your contributions routine. Because in the end, it's not the disruptors or the innovators or the people with the spark who keep the world running. It's the ones with steady hands who build the foundations. And sometimes, when those hands stop building and start dismantling, entire empires can fall in 3 days. Thank you so much for listening to this story of sweet revenge. I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know what country or city you're tuning in from. I love connecting with listeners from around the world. If you enjoyed this tale of corporate justice, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. Have you ever experienced something similar in your workplace? What did you think of Madison's revenge? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.